So welcome everyone to this interview with Tom Mills we have here today, who's written a book about the BBC, which I'm hoping you can plug in at some point. And we're just going to be discussing some of the latest developments with the government's plans for the BBC and how the left should respond to it. So if I can start by just asking you, the government has announced this license fee freeze. And just if you could tell us a little bit about the significance of that and what that means.
Yeah, so the initial news around the license fee freeze focused on the potential for the license fee to be abolished altogether, which was what the government initially had briefed the press. So basically the situation is the BBC's current charter runs to 2027. And then the government's able, in the meantime, to set the rate of the license fee. So what they've said is there'll be a freeze, and then it will rise in line with inflation. So you've got to remember that a freeze, obviously, in public sector terms or in any pay terms, means that it won't be keeping up with inflation, which means, and as we're going into, as everyone anticipates, a higher degree of inflation, this is going to be significant cuts to the BBC's income. And on top of that, there was the announcement that they were not intending to renew the license fee come 2027. So basically, that was the initial headline figure. Now, when Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, briefed Parliament, it seemed like she had rowed back slightly from the idea that the license fee was going to be abolished to the idea that there would be a discussion around the funding mechanisms of the BBC, which, you know, I think is fine. Like the license fee does, in my view, need to be replaced. So there's two elements to it. One is the possibility of a very radical shift in the BBC's funding model in 5 years' time. So that's one sort of distinct political issue and struggle, if you want to put it that way. And then the other one is the prospect of further cuts to the BBC. Now, that's taken place in the context of already very extreme decline in the BBC's income, which is, you know, there are different ways you can calculate these things, but generally the figure that's put out there is figures of around a third to a real terms cut over the course of a decade, which is just an extraordinary decline in income, actually. And that's in a context in which the competition the BBC has to face, although it doesn't face direct economic competition exactly, there are small declines in the pickup of license fees that impacts on its income, in combination with the fact that the government is declining to raise its license fee. So the whole media system's changing. We do need to have a debate about what's going to happen in 5 years with the BBC, what public service broadcasting looks like. But in terms of the announcement of the government, I mean, to my mind, it's essentially a doubling down on the long-term policy of the Conservative government, which has been to deprive the BBC of income, to intimidate the BBC, and to appoint to the BBC politically compliant figures at the same time as putting the BBC under pressure. I think, like under the Johnson government, there's been a particular sort of doubling down of that practice of a control of cultural institutions that's happened at the BBC, but it's not so unusual, and it's also a feature of the BBC's sort of long-standing relationship to the state and political actors. So all of that's happening. There's a degree of continuity. There's also a degree of intensification, and there's the fact that, you know, now we have essentially a 5-year period in which there is, it seems, going to be a policy debate about the future funding model at the BBC, and one in which I would like the left to be active and participating, but one in which perhaps people either feel reluctant to expend any sort of political energy or capital on defending the BBC, and also one in which I think people aren't exactly sure what the left position in any case should be, even if they are feeling mindful to intervene in the debate. So I think that's kind of where we are. I think the other thing to say is that the government itself, and this is just my read of the situation, that aren't exactly sure what it is that they want to do with the BBC, and the right are never quite sure what they want to do with the BBC. They're quite comfortable making a lot of noise about it. complaining about bias, intimidating the BBC, cutting its funding, and so on and so on. And these have been very familiar features, particularly of Conservative governments. But what they've usually lacked, really since the 1990s, is any kind of model for shifting the BBC, apart from an ongoing commercialization of the BBC. And that's been the long-term story, basically, of the BBC for the last 30 years, has been an intensification of commercialization and an intensification of political control. So two elements that have shifted the BBC from being, I would say, a sort of broadly small c conservative social democratic institution towards being more sort of neoliberal institution in the model of other public sector organizations, but also still a highly politicized institution. And I think also one in which the sort of pockets of independence which genuinely existed up until at least the 1990s to some degree have really been quite seriously eroded, except at the edges. So I'm talking more about the sort of influential flagship current affairs programs and news and so on, really has taken on a very marked conservative character. And I think, you know, most people who will be watching this probably, you know, won't need much persuasion on that front, because they'll be quite familiar with, for example, the BBC's coverage of Jeremy Corbyn, but a host of other issues. So people who've been involved in social movements or who follow like particular issues become much more sort of conscious of the political character of the BBC, I think. Sorry, I went a little bit off topic of funding there. So
no, not at all. That was very insightful. Yeah, I mean, I guess my next question is to follow up on what you've raised there in terms of kind of why some people might be conflicted about kind of defending the BBC and, you know, the kind of couple of arguments that I've seen, you know, one is about we shouldn't be defending attacks on people. And of course, this is the argument that the Tories have put forward themselves. I mean, Nadine Dorries tried to suggest that the primary concern around this pay freeze is protecting people from the cost of living crisis, because you know, £8 a year is a big problem, which they're concerned about, but £700 in energy bills is fine. But this is one of the arguments that I've seen people on the left put forward. And the other is, of course, the right-wing bias. And you mentioned the appalling treatment of Jeremy Corbyn and you know, we've seen like coverage over Palestine and other things. Yeah. So what's your kind of response to that? And why do you think the left should be active in defending the BBC?
Well, I think okay, so part of the problem, I think, on the left on the BBC. So let's use the left in a slightly broader term than I expect you're sort of alluding to. So to include the centre left and, you know, people who we might associate more with the right of the Labour Party. So to think in a sort of broad policy left, incorporating, you know, like people of the Guardian and so on. That broad left, I would say, and incorporating parts of the socialist left as well, but much less so these days, has generally seen the BBC as being a public institution that needs to be protected against the sort of predations of the Murdochs of this world, the oligarchs who otherwise run our media system. And that's sort of a pragmatic position that the left has taken. I mean, it makes sense and it's coherent. It's personally not one that I agree with for a number of reasons, but it sort of makes sense. So basically, it becomes defended as a public institution. Now, that obviously becomes much more difficult when it feels like that public institution is having a damaging effect on even the possibilities for moderate political change in this country, as took place with the BBC's treatment of Jeremy Corbyn. So I think that's obviously where a lot of the left has ended up in terms of their orientation towards the BBC. What was your other example? Sorry, I've lost my train of thought now.
Just about kind of not defending attacks on people in terms of the license fee.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Of course. So in terms of license fee payers, the BBC is funded predominantly by a flat tax, which is a regressive tax, and does fall disproportionately on low-income groups. I mean, that's just a fact, and I don't think anybody on the left should be in a position of defending flat taxes. You know, these are regressive taxes. And there's a good reason why, the approach of Conservative governments has often been to increase flat taxes simply because they have the effect of upward distribution of income. That's the whole point of, say, VAT increases and so on. So I certainly don't think the left should be boxed in, number one, by the first aspect that I was talking about, which was a simple defense of an institution which we should recognize as being flawed. But number two, being in a position of defending a form of regressive taxation, which, frankly, in any other circumstance, we simply wouldn't be defending. The principle to defend is the principle of public media. Now, the problem there is, number one, that gets conflated with the license fee. And number two, it gets conflated with the BBC. I mean, they sort of overlap with each other. But in the case of the license fee, like, number one, it doesn't actually afford the method of it doesn't afford the political independence that is claimed by defenders of the BBC. I mean, this isn't a controversial point. I mean, the empirical record on this, I mean, the historical record is very, very clear, but we don't even need to point to like declassified files, which we can do. We can just look at the current situation where it's very clear that governments use the license fee and the threats to change the rate of the license fee as a way of disciplining the political leadership of the BBC. Now, nobody who's serious denies that. I mean, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who aren't serious in British public life, but that's the fact. So I don't think we should be defending either the license fee or the BBC as it currently exists, which frankly, on certain areas of political reporting, just simply is not fit for purpose. But the question becomes, for me anyway, politically, is a different question to how do I feel about how the BBC has treated the left, how it's treated Palestinians, how it's treated their political representatives, how it's treated people on the socialist left. Because, if you wronged me in some way, I would expect some recompense for what you've done. I just don't think we should think about institutions in those terms. Like, there are people at the BBC who have made editorial decisions who I think, should be culpable and accountable for them in their professional lives in the same way as any politician is, or any academic or anybody else. But to say that, okay, to hell with this institution because it did X, Y, and Z, I just think to me, it just feels like it's a response to a personal wrong rather than a political analysis of the situation. Now, to me, the political analysis of an institution should be based on, okay, what's the nature of that institution? Why does it do what it does? And is it in fact reformable? Now, that's a different question to how politically damaging has that institution been, right? So, we could think about the British Army, and we could probably have an interesting conversation about the political character of the British Army, and we'd probably agree that politically that's been a highly regressive and harmful institution, or say the police, right? But the question of how much harm it's done, and the same with the BBC, to me is a different question to how reformable is the institution. So to me, that's a sort of intellectual question, which comes back to the structure itself that then produces the culture, then produces the outcomes, that then produces the social harm. Sorry, I know this is getting a bit abstract, but what I'm trying to get across here is that I think the position of the left should be, okay, fine, the BBC's done X, Y, or Z, but the question of how we respond politically shouldn't be to do with it's done us wrong. It should be to do with, okay, why is it done what it's done? What's the nature of this institution? What leads to that? Now, what I've tried to do with my work on the BBC, what I try and do in the book, is to think about the BBC, I think in relatively accessible terms, I hope, as a social structure with a distinct sort of culture that's linked to its relationship to the state and its embeddedness in the market. These two aspects that give it a particular kind of political character that then drive the way that it reports and drove the way it responds to, for example, Jeremy Corbyn. So when I started researching the BBC, I was interested in how the BBC behaved during times of war, and then I was interested in its relationship to the state and unpacking some of the complexities of that. Well, I ended up being much more interested in how the BBC reports about the economy, because, I mean, partly because of a lot of people have done work on the BBC and war, but also because I started around the time of the 2008 financial crash, and I wanted to get a sense of, well, why does the BBC report on the economy in a particular way? What's the BBC's relationship been to the market, and so on and so on? This is a major feature of my book. Why do I say this? Well, when Jeremy Corbyn came along, essentially there were two aspects to his politics and the political movement that propelled him there. Like, number one was the anti-war movement, and number two was the anti-austerity movement, which obviously had some significant overlaps. And Jeremy Corbyn was very much a figurehead of those particular networks. And also that's what attracted a lot of people to his politics, whether they've been involved in politics or not, particularly on the anti-austerity side, right? And then there's a leader of the Labour Party there who's committed to two things, anti-war, anti-austerity, which really have become very much part of the BBC's, you know, institutional DNA, if you like. They've always had an extremely close relationship to the British state. So on questions of foreign policy, as you probably know from listening to or watching the BBC yourself, if it touches on the interests of the British state, it's just reporting just becomes just kind of ridiculous. And, you know, we know that it can do better reporting, because even on the World Service, it will report much better than it on like domestic television, particularly, and most radio. So there's a culture at the BBC which is shaped by its relationship to the state and the market. Now, to my mind, the question that then becomes, okay, what can we actually do about that? Right? Do we need to get rid of this institution and build something completely new? Is that a serious political prospect? If the BBC disappeared as we know it now, would that be a bad thing or not? These are political questions we face. My belief is that the BBC is reformable, and what we've done at the Media Reform Coalition, and what I've done in my work before my involvement in the Media Reform Coalition, is think about, okay, here's the problems with the BBC. Can we address them by altering its structure, altering its relationship to the British state, deepening its, or creating a more democratic and devolved institution that's more responsive to the public it's supposed to represent? In other words, to create the sort of institution that the BBC claims to be. So that's what I've been developing, and as part of the work we do at the Media Reform Coalition. And to my mind, we've got 5 years basically to intervene in this debate, which the government says it wants to start, about what the BBC will look like, it should look like in the 21st century. That is not, to my mind, a debate the left should be shying away from. We should be welcoming that. What we need to be doing is trying to persuade people that actually there is a version of public digital media which is efficient and modern and democratic, that can replace the model that we've inherited from 20th century broadcasting, but also address some of the problems that we already know about that. The government wants a different model. It's not very clear what they want, but essentially what they're looking to do, it seems, is to move over towards a subscription model, or some mix of subscription with other forms of income. Now, the problem with that is that, and I think some people on the left do seem, at least on the surface of it, sympathetic to that. The problem with that is that in fact, a central principle of public media is not merely that you have an institution which is not owned by capitalists or isn't driven by commercial expediency, but also you have to have an institution which, in terms of its accessibility, what it's putting out there, it has to be accessible to everybody. So if you have a private institution, they need to build paywalls and they need to commercialize their content. If you have a public institution, then it's available to everybody. So the principle behind that is basically information that allows for democratic and participation in society and universal access to culture. It's not a particularly left-wing ideal. It's a very basic liberal principle that should underline democratic participation. So there should be a fairly broad, if liberals were as good as their name, there should be a fairly broad political support for that. So that's universalism. On top of that, I think there's a lot more than arguments that need to be made. But to come back to your original question about low-income groups and the license fee and so on, there's no reason why you can't have a household levy that's based on the ability to pay, that you have some forms of exemption, that funding comes out of public taxation, as long as that isn't like sort of absorbed into the exchequer, basically. So you can't have the government immediately setting the terms of the license fee. It needs to be ring-fenced and guaranteed, and the BBC needs to be put on a statutory footing. So I think the funding mechanism needs to be modernised. But I think more profoundly, the governance model needs to be modernized. So these are the arguments that I would like the left to be making and familiarizing themselves with in the next year and going on for 2027.
Okay, yeah, that was very comprehensive, and you did a little bit of my job there with asking the right questions. So thank you. I guess kind of following on slightly. I mean, I think what you set out is a kind of good program for the left to kind of get on board with kind of grappling with the ideas of what we want to be fighting for and how we can intervene in this debate around the BBC. But I mean, with the BBC and in the mainstream media more generally, we do see the situation where, you know, like you said, it is dominated by the right. I mean, with the BBC at the moment, we have this kind of revolving door with the government in terms of its senior officials. With the Guardian, I mean, apart from the damaging role it played during the Corbyn years, we now see it's hired the Daily Mail, you know, former journalist who was responsible for Ruthie and all the rest of it. So in the kind of here and now, how do you think that the left should be dealing with the media? And, you know, is the answer kind of just kind of being, you know, fully immersed in this debate around the BBC and thinking about public broadcast media and that kind of campaigning? Or is it about kind of setting up alternative left-wing media, or is there a combination of both or something else? Just want to see your thoughts on that.
My view is that the number one, that the left needs to have a defense of the BBC and a defense of Channel 4 as well, and public service broadcasting in general, which will have no truck with the BBC how it currently is. We can't afford to be just defending the BBC as being wonderful and, like, you know, banging on about Fleabag or David Attenborough or the rest of it. If you want to have a serious defense of public service broadcasting and an alternative vision, then it needs to be based in a critique of the existing institution. And I mean, I think that's obvious. And it's not even, I mean, look, number one, it's just living in the real world. Like, I think people can see what the BBC is like and how it reports, at least the people that need to be politically mobilized. It's just a reality-based account, but also just for politically obvious reasons. If you keep defending the institution, the right will keep eroding it, commercializing it, and eroding its independence. You're just going to be constantly on the back foot, and you know, and you're losing even the thing that you're claiming to be defending. So even from a strategic position, it doesn't really make sense to be defending the BBC without advancing a critique. Now, in terms of the relationship to the left and alternative forms of media, I mean, I think speaking more as like a person on the left than like an analyst of the BBC, I would say absolutely the left needs to build alternative forms of media. Don't rely on the BBC or these other institutions to be developing a strategy for positive social change. And I think if people didn't believe that 10 years ago, then they probably are wising up to that fact now. Now, there are institutions like the Daily Mail and the Sunday Times and the rest of them who are just straightforwardly instruments of billionaire tax avoiders. You know, it's no great mystery as to what kinds of social interests these organizations serve. I think with the BBC and the Guardian particularly, it's a slightly more complicated question for people to understand exactly what the nature of these institutions are and how they function. Now, I think that's just a question of like political education. You know, and I hope that doesn't sound sort of patronizing, but like people don't know about these institutions. It's not like just by reading the Guardian or watching the BBC, you get any understanding of what drives them. You know, I don't fully understand the Guardian because it's a relatively opaque institution. I mean, there's been some interesting stuff I saw recently on Novara Media that come out. Des Friedman put together a good collection I contributed to, which was looking at the policy and reflecting on the politics of the Guardian. So there's some useful work out there, and I think people need to make political use of that. You need to have a critique of these institutions that also recognize speeches that I think the left should want to preserve, defend, and develop and enrich. So in the case of the Guardian, there's a reason why it doesn't report in the same way as the Daily Mail or even the Independent, which has a sort of much less coherent sort of politics, which is more of a sort of clickbait type model, but traditionally would, I suppose, have a similar sort of political center of gravity. And that's that the Guardian does have a different ownership model and a different business model. Now, obviously, the BBC is a different creature to the Daily Mail. So I think the idea that we need to be careful about saying, oh, the media, the mainstream media, these are, I think that's a useful term. I mean, there's a lot of very snooty people who say, oh, mainstream media, anyone who says that an idiot. No, it's a useful word to describe these sets of institutions, but obviously they're different parts of the institutions have a different character. The nature of those institutions, you have to build an alternative models, and that's very difficult to do in terms of developing business models and the rest of it. But the way that I would see that fitting into the broader campaign for media reform is to think about developing sorts of alternative practices which can sort of prefigure and try and point towards different types of journalism, right? And I would want, but the one thing I would say about that is I think there are elements of the public media, the BBC and so on, which, you know, I don't want the BBC to just be like a left-wing institution. I would like it to be what it claims to be, which is like trying to inform people about the nature of political debates. I would like it not to marginalize and ridicule the left and allow those arguments, you know, to actually be exposed to voters. I don't think, you know, so I think there's a difference between saying, oh, we want a BBC that should actually just do its job, which is what most people on the left want, and a media that serves a particular set of social interests, which is like movements media. So I think they're a slightly different thing. That said, what I would like to see is a more devolved media institution that is much more responsive to these kinds of localized projects. I mean, basically the BBC is a big institution that sits in the heart of a network of organizations which have got no authentic development, no authentic sort of, okay, then that's a little unfair, sits at the center of a media system of mostly or dominated by large commercial media companies, right? And parts of a news media system, which are also very large media organizations. And then we have these digital giants as well, which are some of the largest and richest organizations in the history of the world, right? So that's the system of which the BBC is part. It could be part, I think, of a more devolved media ecology, and I'm trying to think of a better word now because I always feel a bit cringy when I say ecology, but where you have devolved systems of producers, right? And people, the sorts of people who are involved in independent media projects who at the moment don't have many resources but are doing very good work. There's no reason why we can't have the BBC as part of that broader network. What the BBC used to do was it would used to provide training and you know, forms of expertise for people who would then move in and out of other institutions, like say into ITV or Channel 4 or newspapers or wherever. I think it'd be, you know, the BBC could function like that. It could be at the heart of a more devolved institution, and that's something we've been exploring at the Media Reform Coalition in this report from the Beyond the BBC project. And at the heart of that is the idea of a media commons. So it's the idea that we need to think of the media as being a resource that belongs to everybody, but also we don't think of it as public broadcasting as merely being just the BBC. We can think of it as being something which is much more devolved, much more participatory, much more democratic. And so that's where we're developing those sets of visions. And you know, you can think about some of the work that my friend Dan Hind has been doing for years on democratic commissioning processes, where you take some of the editorial power that at the moment is basically dominated by the London upper middle classes to higher up the social strata, and you try and devolve that and democratize it. So I think there's lots of interesting experiments which say participatory budgeting and stuff like that, which we should be thinking about incorporating into the media system. So that's what we're going to be working on at the Media Reform Coalition for the next few years, building on the work that we've already done. And I hope that people watching this will be involved in that and come to the Media Democracy Festival, which we hold every year, and also contribute to the debate. So in my mind, it's about defending an institution, but without any illusions about what it is. But not letting that compromise your vision of an alternative, because the government, insofar as the government has an alternative, it's quite a grim one. It's basically sort of Netflix plus state media, really. And I don't think that's what anybody wants, apart from them.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I thought that was a lot of food for thought. And I'll share the links for the Media Reform Coalition so people can find out more and get more involved. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today. And yeah, good luck with the work that you're doing.
Thanks for having me.